What's scanning my osteoporotic bones? My name is Jeff and I can't keep a straight face. This is How It's Med, the podcast where we watch the introductions and also talk to the people who are shaping the future of healthcare. My guest today is Dr. Alexander Bilbily for this sub podcast of MedTech Talks. How's it going, Alex?
It's going well. How are you, Jeff?
I'm kind of scared because at any moment my cat could pop out of here, and we just posted a trailer where I saw myself picking the cat off the table on screen. So I'm just constantly on the lookout. He's absolutely terrifying.
It's not the end of the world. I'm sure your viewers would enjoy a little break.
You see, Goose is out to get me. I think he wants to be the star of the show, but I can't let that happen. In all seriousness, though, like I've read a little bit into who you are, and we've chatted a little bit about, what you do, but like, it seems like you're balancing so much. How are you doing though? Like, how are you balancing this all?
Google Calendar, Asana, several lists in several different places. Um, it's just my organization and time management skills have evolved out of necessity.
Yeah.
When I was in high school and undergrad, you ask my friends, I was never the most organized. I was never the person that was always on time,
hmm
but it became necessary to function and just sort of evolved from there.
Well, I mean, I definitely have something to learn from you. But without further ado, like let's dig in. You talked a little bit about how you weren't organized before when you were younger, perhaps even before medicine. Hi, Goose. Um, what was your path into medicine? Like, why choose this specific area of expertise or career to focus in?
When I was younger, I mean, I wasn't very forward thinking. Like I was very much living my childhood life, and I had a great childhood. Played sports, played video games, hung out with friends all the time, and I never really thought too much about the future because the present was so good.
Yeah.
But my family is very much medicine focused. My parents and my brother and my aunts and uncles and cousins are most of them are physicians. If they're not, they're either pharmacists. So medicine is big in my family,
hmm
and so I guess I was just sort of on a default path, to be honest with you. And in sort of my third year of medical school, you got to figure out what you want to do.
Yeah.
So your specialty, your residency. And I mean, there was, I think, 34, 37 different options when I was a med
Plenty
student.
more
And
now.
I'm sure there's more now. And it's not realistic to be able to truly evaluate all of these potential careers, many of which are totally different lives,
hmm
right? Like going to the OR in the morning and having clinic versus reading slides for pathology or reading images for X-ray, like very different lives,
Yeah.
right? So I spent as much time as I could evaluating different options, but I knew I was always interested in computer science and physics ever since I was a little boy. And so radiology was kind of natural for me. And then what really sealed the deal for me is I knew I wanted to do something with computer science, and then right around the time I was finishing medical school, like a landmark AI paper came out. It was the ImageNet paper
hmm
from the University of Toronto, and as soon as I saw that, I was like, "Done. Radiology, machine learning, let's go." And and here we are today.
That's fascinating. So you had these combined interests of, I guess, medicine from kind of the nurture that your family had being surrounded by people in medicine, as well as your personal interest in computer science. I mean, did you have or did you attempt to bring these fields together before residency or before medical school, or was it just something that kind of came together over time?
No, so there were a few attempts made. Probably the best one I made was when I was an undergrad, where my parents are family physicians, and they had a problem where a lot of they had a pretty big sort of patient population they were looking after, and it was hard to keep track of who's due for a screening test or like a pap smear or a fecal occult blood test or a colonoscopy. And so I made a very simple sort of program with a front end that basically will keep track of patients when they've had these tests and will basically let the receptionist know that, this list of patients, they need an update of their mammogram or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and what's cool is that with that simple program, we can also like track adherence. So we can see that, before we started using it, like 70%, we had 70% adherence rate. And then as we started using it, there's like 80 and 90%. And it's really just a nudge, right? Just to let the patient know that, you know what, because most people are pretty concerned and want to do what's best for themselves, which was with
Hmm.
their healthcare.
Hmm.
It's just a matter of letting them know. And it seemed to very simple approach, but seemed to work really well. And that's also kind of the first time I got the sense that like, doing something where you feel like you potentially save lives or even actually save lives or even just improve somebody's quality of life, it's a very different sense of accomplishment than anything else I've experienced, whether, um, creating a cool program that's not related to medicine or achieving a certain score, a certain mark or whatever. Like they feel fundamentally different. And that's what really sort of attracted me to medicine as well.
Hmm. Hmm. So, I mean, you focused on radiology partly because you just said there was that tie-in with machine learning and AI, all these new fields that are coming about, and the applicability of the sheer amount of data that's available in the radiology space. But you also just mentioned to me that you like to have that impact of improving patient lives. So why not focus on direct patient care? Why focus on radiology?
Oh, well, that's because I when I went through medical school, like, I really loved figuring out what's going on,
Yeah.
but I didn't really enjoy the management part of patient care. I hope that's not bad to say. It just I didn't find it as interesting and as stimulating for
Yeah.
me. I understand, like, I mean, I'm not saying it's not intellectually stimulating, it very much is, especially now where there's all these new therapeutics,
Hmm.
like, across the whole range of the therapeutic spectrum. But back when I was sort of in med school and I was, like, in internal medicine, it's like, "Okay, the treatment for this is, this much fluids at this flow rate with this medicine," and just, like, to me, that wasn't really striking a chord. It was really more like, "Okay, this patient comes in with this constellation of symptoms, and these are the sort of findings on investigations or whatever. What's the diagnosis
Yeah.
here?" And that's what attracted me to diagnostic
Hmm.
radiology even though a lot of our actual day-to-day work is, following things up or tracking disease, but there's still that really exciting part of diagnostic radiology where you make the diagnosis. And that's before we started the call, I was telling you how I actually enjoyed being on call as a resident. And it's because of that. It's because an unknown comes to you and you've got to figure out what's going on. And that dictates the whole treatment path. So I felt like I found it more interesting.
Hmm. So you definitely like solving the problems, but how, like, what? So for those who don't know what radiology is in the audience, what is radiology, and how has the practice of it changed from the span of when you first entered your residency program to where you are now?
So, first question. So, radiology is basically the interpretation of medical images for the most part. There's different fields of radiology where you do interventional radiology and actually intervene and do certain things. But in general, it's you acquire imaging information, whether it's from ultrasound, CT, MRI, nuclear medicine studies, and you interpret these images
Hmm.
with the idea of providing some sort of clinically actionable information
Hmm.
that can help further this patient's care. Um, and so, like CAT scans, this is all under the sort of umbrella of radiology.
Yeah.
In terms of how radiology has changed from when I was a trainee, like I finished my radiology residency about three years ago, um, and I started in 2013 or 2014. I feel like it hasn't really the practice of radiology hasn't really changed that much. Um, there's always new technology, new techniques that are introduced. But at least during the past, 7 years, to me, they've pretty much all felt incremental as opposed to like ground shifting.
Hmm.
Um, improved scanner times, different ways of acquiring MRI images that maybe you can use it now for newer indications or other
Yeah.
indications, like other clinical scenarios than before. But to me, these are sort of incremental, and the actual day-to-day practice of radiology hasn't changed that much. Other than I think everybody is just busier, just the sheer volume of work is just higher across the board.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So you mentioned that the sheer volume of work is higher because there's so much need. And this constant theme in medicine, or at least in healthcare overall, is that there's so much need, but often it goes unfulfilled because of funding problems, lack of equipment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, there's certainly the benefit of novel algorithms that will allow for some work to be taken off of radiologists' plate to allow for radiologists to be used where they're most needed. But at the same time, I think there's perhaps, maybe I'm wrong, this broader sentiment of these novel algorithms taking over some of the work that radiologists do. Is that fear pervasive, or is the attitude more towards the former thing that I just said?
So let me backtrack just a little bit.
Sure.
When I say like the practice of radiology hasn't changed, I think that is true for the most part.
Okay.
We're starting to see like little slivers of sort of intelligent augmentation
Uh-huh.
across the sort of radiology workflow now. Like I don't really use any of that in my practice, and I don't know if there's any of that in use at our hospital in particular, but you see these news articles about certain hospitals implementing certain little things that are designed to either improve efficiency or quality or safety. So we're starting to see that now. Um, the reason that's related is because your question of like, um, how is this going to impact the day to day work of
Yeah.
the radiologist?
Yeah.
And ultimately, how does it impact sort of healthcare system and the patient in the end? And I think that if we were talking 3, 4 years ago, the culture around machine learning and medicine and radiology in particular was very adversarial. Like you have computer scientists going on record, like or venture capitalists, these sort of tech folks that go on record and say, you know, practicing radiology should be criminal in 5 years because he's out of I kid you not, right?
That's
Like, I'm not gonna
wild.
say who said that, but, yeah, that's been said, and I was there in reality when that was said,
Jeez.
and it's just so that adversarial culture,
Yeah.
I think is not as pervasive anymore.
Okay.
People are realizing that, it's to the benefit of the healthcare system and to the patient that we sort of work together, both the medical side and the technology, computer science, business side, and bring solutions that are validated, are safe, are effective, and that makes sense from a workflow perspective. And I think that's what we're starting to see a little bit now. And I am sure that in the next 5 years, we're going to see a lot more of it,
Hmm.
partly because the stresses on the healthcare system like demand some solution because the current trajectory is simply not sustainable.
Hmm. Hmm. That's fascinating. Okay. So, I mean, when that landmark paper came out, that's when you decided to go into radiology, correct? I'm just getting the timeline straight.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. That's when I firmly made my decision. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, how much academic research is there? Because academic research is what's expected from clinicians and residents. How much academic research is there on the effectiveness and applications of these novel tools?
it's a it's a great question. There is actually I just read something I think earlier today, this morning. There's been 20,000 AI publications in medicine, but less than 1% of them would meet a quality bar to be included in a meta-analysis.
Hmm.
And I think that's very much in keeping with my experience and my colleagues' experiences. You see all of these papers come out that say, so and so algorithm performs better than radiologists in diagnosing X, or so and so algorithm does better than, whatever in diagnosing whatever. And you when you look into these papers, the vast majority of them, they use a retrospective data set, they do retrospective testing, there's no form of external validation, and there's actually relatively little insight into the methodology that you would need to like properly evaluate the paper.
Hmm.
And I think that's why we've seen, these sort of like implementational disasters where you have an AI algorithm that's developed by a group and it looks like it performs spectacularly, and then it's deployed somewhere else and it's like a coin flip in terms of its performance. And it's because people are not yet used to how to properly evaluate and validate these algorithms. Um, we can talk deep. There's reasons
Yeah.
why that is. I don't think that might take an hour, but I think we're as a medical body, we're now like I have a meeting later today where we're introducing an AI curriculum into medical teaching
Huh.
to predominantly to give uh, medical students and clinicians critical appraisal skills as it relates to AI. You know how we build critical appraisal skills for evaluating clinical trial, and if the methodology is sound, same sort of thing, same kind of tool, but for a slightly different use case.
That's fascinating because, I mean, first of all, I'm a little salty because I missed out on computer science being included in my high school education, and now I'm missing out on AI being included in my medical education. So I just seem to miss the good parts. This is
Hey, there,
infuriating.
you got YouTube. You got YouTube. You have no excuse.
All right, you better hold me to that. But I mean, regardless of that, it seems like, academic medicine hasn't really yet figured out a way to study the effectiveness of these tools. And I've done a little review of, for example, the effectiveness of different companies' sepsis detection tools as well. And I mean, again, they're rather scattered. The quality of the studies leaves much to be desired. So, I mean, given this academic background that you must have been steeped in during your residency, what led you towards a more entrepreneurial path instead of focusing just on the academic medicine path and trying to improve that?
I think the answer for me, I think, is very simple. Like, I'm doing this. We're sort of the vision of the the reason this like our startup company exists is to impact as many people as possible in a positive way. And in order to do that, you need to not only develop an impactful technology, but you need to somehow distribute it and support it and get it through approvals. And there has to be some entity that supports the product, right? This thing. And as far as I could see, there was no real way to do that efficiently from within an academic setting alone. Often, like, I think that's the real value of companies is there's kind of this vehicle where you can say, "This is the mission," and you can raise money for that mission. You can build policies that support that mission, and it's an entity that spans, it's not tied to one institution. It's sort of everywhere, like, it could be anywhere, and that's why, that's what we decided to do, my co-founder, Mark Cicero, and I, is to basically start this thing because our goal is to impact as many people, and we found no way to do that from within purely an academic setting.
Hmm. So let's backtrack a little and talk a little bit about the story of 16-bit. How did your co-founder and you meet? What was the problem that sparked that idea or that impetus to start a company? And where have you guys gone, or what were some highlights of your 16-bit experience so far?
There's been a lot of sort of it's been a roller coaster. It's been a lot of fun and excitement and challenges. But how we started was uh, Mark. We met in residency, so both of us were radiology residents at University of Toronto. Mark is an engineer by background, and and we basically both were interested in machine learning at the same time. We found ourselves sort of in the same program, and we did a research project together. This is a project to basically train a convolutional neural network to detect pathology on chest X-ray. It's very like trivial now, but back then I think it was the first, or at least one of the first papers to do that.
Hmm.
Um, and from that, we sort of started to think about and explore other ways that we can make impactful things. And then we were both at a hospital at that time, at the same hospital, same academic hospital, and we tried to explore a way to do that from within the hospital, but it became challenging. There were a lot of roadblocks, and although we overcame some of them, we couldn't overcome all of them. And then it became pretty clear that we should do this from within a separate sort of company. And that's really why and how we spawned the business. Um, Shortly after we incorporated in October of 2016, there was the uh, RSNA 2017 machine learning competition for pediatric bone age. And this was the first big international medical imaging AI competition held by the RSNA, which is one of the largest medical organizations in the world, definitely the largest for radiology. And we ended up winning that competition. And this is November 2017.
Mhm.
And that gave us a lot of gave us a lot of confidence for sure, because we thought we were good at what we do, which is bridging the clinical and technical gaps.
Yeah.
Um, but we didn't know, right? We just thought we were good at what we did, but we didn't know for sure. Winning that competition did big things. It sort of gave us internal confidence to move forward, but it also gave us some credibility to separate ourselves from a lot of the what we perceive as noise in the industry.
Hmm. That's fascinating. It seems like that first win was so important to you in terms of building some kind of team culture. But in the broad world of founding like med tech companies, unless you go into um, accelerators or competitions, such as like what you did, apart from trying to raise funds, like it seems like those wins are so hard to come by, and it might be difficult for physicians and their teams or healthcare workers and their teams to coalesce around an idea and to feel like they can do it. Like, is my notion here wrong, or do you think that perhaps, I guess I don't know what I'm saying here. It, how important was that win to you? Because it seems like it was.
I think it was important to us, for the reasons that I
Yeah.
mentioned. Uh, but I also think that, having been in the health tech ecosystem in Toronto for several years now, there's been a huge shift and a
Hmm.
big change. Like opportunities that were available before were kind of, I would say, much more sparse than they are now. So if you're a health tech innovator,
Yeah.
at least in Toronto, I'm sure I mean, definitely similar patterns are occurring elsewhere, but from my personal experience in Toronto, there's so much more opportunity now, whether it's like support from amazing programs like H2I, which is the Health to Innovation. It's like a UFT spawned accelerator for health tech companies. Um, Mars has initiatives. The Vector Institute is now sort of like this national, provincial investment into the AI ecosystem. There's so many opportunities now that you know you don't need to win an international competition to get the right people in play, get the right people interested in what you're doing to be successful.
Hmm. Hmm. So, I mean, since that win, what has 16-bit done?
So, um, we competed again the following year for pneumonia. We came fourth out of, I think it was 1,499 teams. So we did pretty
Not
well.
shabby.
Yeah, not shabby. Honestly, the competitions are really fun, but also become a little distracting because you're also trying to build a business, right? So um,
Yeah.
the challenge of the business is you have to do things that you find interesting, but also things that make financial sense and that have a path forward from a commercialization perspective. So we couldn't just keep competing in competitions, even though it is fun. Um, we've been the recipient of several grants. One is to help build a COVID-19 tool
Hmm.
to help monitor inpatients suffering from COVID-19.
He doesn't
Hey,
care. He
Goose.
doesn't care.
Maybe Goose has something to say about the health
Let
tech
me bring him
ecosystem
on.
in Toronto.
Sir, do you have anything to say? I think he's speechless. But go on.
Strong silent type. What else have we done? So there's a couple different initiatives we're working on. We actually were working on mammography for a while, but we found it really tough to get the necessary data that we needed um, within a reasonable amount of time before sort of international competitors kind of outpaced us in that space.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then we started thinking a lot more about less obvious applications of machine learning that could be potentially very impactful.
Mm-hmm.
And we started going down this sort of the we started going down this way of thinking, but specifically for osteoporosis. And we created a partnership with Amgen that they funded some of our early work. We found a data, like a Canadian data set that we could use. We proved the concept, and then we filed for a provisional patent, which was followed by a non-provisional patent, which we should be hearing back. The turnaround time is like very long. It's like 18 months. I think we're like at the tail end of that now. And then we got another data set to sort of further refine the algorithms and test them, like externally validate them. And then we started, building a product around it because it's one thing to have an
Yeah.
algorithm, but you got to build a product to serve that algorithm and integrate into the workflow and do all that. And all the meanwhile, we're having conversations with um, regulatory consultants and trying to figure out our regulatory path forward. And something we're very proud of is we achieved FDA breakthrough status for our osteoporosis product,
What's that?
which is so the FDA breakthrough status is essentially a formal acknowledgement by the FDA saying that your product is potentially very impactful for the population.
Uh-huh.
So we're committed to work with you closely and interface with you regularly to basically define the best regulatory path and try to get it approved as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been a very informative and fruitful program, and we're really want to thank the FDA for that. It's been very helpful for us, and so that's where we stand today. Today we stand where we have the MVP of the product done. We're just doing some final testing on it. And we're prepared to submit Health Canada application soon. And also we've interfaced with the FDA for almost a year now to trying to define the best regulatory path forward in the US.
That's fascinating. You've done so much in terms of actually moving the product forward, but you see, the real killer question here is how did you come up with the name 16-bit?
Both. So we always get that question because I guess it's a very like nuanced reasoning for it. So most normal images are stored in what's called 8-bit RGB. So it's usually like three numbers between 0 and 256, and that defines like the image and the color. In medical images, um, they're usually grayscale images, so there's no three color channel. There's one channel, but that integer, instead of going from 0 to 255 or 256, depending on your framework, it goes from 0 to 65,536. And that's encoded in 16 bits.
Mm-hmm.
It takes 16 bits to encode an integer like that, and that's the max amount that medical images can be encoded in. And the reasoning for that is 16 bits sort of speaks to our technical domain knowledge. Like
It's
we
certainly
have
technical.
deep domain knowledge. It is technical, but also speaks to like so there's 65,536 shades of gray. Our eyes can only see a couple of them. And that's why in radiology, we always sort of window. That's what windowing does. It's so we can look at different parts of this range of data.
Oh, that's what windowing does.
Yes,
Okay.
that's what windowing
Okay.
does. That's the one Doug does. So our namesake is sort of trying to say, like, we're trying to see the whole picture here. We're trying to extract all the information we can from the data that's available to us.
That was, did you think of that all the way through naming your company? Or was it something that you back justified?
No, we when we were deciding on what to name the company, we had a brainstorming session, and that's what we came up with.
That's
Yeah, and that was the reasoning.
that's fascinating. Wow. Okay. So, I mean, back to the actual product that you've made. Um, in my encounters with some companies that are doing that are considering like protection of the ideas that makes them what they are, so patenting. There's been this back and forth about patenting software or algorithms. Like on one hand, if you patent, sure you do protect it, but on the other hand, by patenting, you publish the ideas behind what makes your product tick, and that can be back engineered. So why did you choose to go with the route of patenting the software that you have?
It's a good question. Um, Patenting AI algorithms is a very tricky new area. Again, this sort of reminds me of another program that we leverage from the ecosystem that's available to us is through TD Bank. They have this like patent program where they offer um, patent funding for patent lawyers and intellectual property protection for startups. So we leverage that to basically hire probably the world's best firm that is sort of based out of California, and they do a lot of AI patent work.
Mhm.
Um, and what we've decided to patent is kind of like how it's used. So you don't patent the algorithm itself, but you patent the way in which or the embodiment in which it's used.
Okay.
And so that's what we decided to patent. There's a couple reasons it's useful from a startup perspective. One is it is some potential level of protection. Um, when you're a startup, you're often competing with a lot of players, and these players can be small startups like you, or very well-funded companies, or international conglomerates. So having some level of protection, I think is sound strategic thinking. The other reason is that it's favorable from an investor focus.
Mhm.
So if you're looking to raise money, and we haven't raised any dilutive money yet, we've been really lucky in that we've again leveraged the ecosystem available to us and basically used our academic side to fund the work through academic industry grants. But if and when we do decide to raise money, it's very favorable. Investors see it very favorable when we have when we've thought about how are we going to protect the innovation that we've created, and one way to do that is through patenting.
Mhm. Okay. All right. So, I mean, patenting is just one step of the process of, I guess, putting your company together. Another, as you mentioned before, is the regulatory approval. So, I mean, I know it's a complex issue and we could talk for more than an hour about it, but the area of approving um, novel algorithms, novel ways of, processing data and coming up with a useful output, that in itself isn't something that's existed for very long in terms of our technical toolkit. So, what are the nuances that I think we mentioned before, just to frame this conversation? That if you set the bar too high in terms of what it takes to approve, or in terms of proof that your algorithm works, if you set that bar too high, then people won't go for the approval, or won't try to develop these products because it'll be too hard. But if you set it too low, then you run the risk that you run the risk that the algorithm won't work. So, do you have a more nuanced approach to thinking about this or voicing it? Because I'm a beginner, and like I'm assuming that a lot of our listeners don't really know about the nuance of this as well.
Yeah. So like you said, it's a really important problem to think about or to solve, because if the bar is too high to get regulatory approved as an AI product, then you're basically you're doing a disservice to the population because you're preventing potentially life-saving technology from reaching patients. But if you set the bar too low, you're also doing a disservice to the population because you're potentially letting unsafe algorithms get to the patient. So the the measure by which you validate an algorithm for approval should be scaled according to the risk of the algorithm. So if the algorithm dictates autonomously whether somebody goes for surgery or not, that bar better be very high,
Hmm.
right? But if the algorithm, in our case, our algorithm leverages existing data, images that have already been acquired on the patient, to extract essentially whether this patient's at risk of osteoporosis or not. The next step being a conversation with the patient to discuss their clinical risk factors for osteoporosis. Maybe the bar shouldn't be set super high because the risk to the patient is relatively low.
Yeah.
The next step that our algorithm would sort of trigger is a conversation with the patient.
Hmm.
And the next step after that might be a DEXA scan, which is associated with a very fractional amount of radiation and doesn't cost the healthcare system that much money. So this is how you make the argument for the level of validation required for your algorithm. And I mentioned the FDA breakthrough conversations we've been having with the FDA. Um, that's a lot of what we're talking about is like they want to understand what is the risk benefit profile. So, how much harm can we potentially cause to the patient relative to how much benefit we can cause the patient? And they have to understand that in order to iterate with us on what is an appropriate level of rigor when it comes to the clinical validation. I think I think at a minimum, there has to be some measure of the algorithm's generalizability. And what I mean by that is in order to develop an AI algorithm, you basically take a data set and you train and you validate and sometimes you test on that data set.
Hmm.
But if your methodology is not sound or if you're unlucky, everything might look great. But as soon as you take this algorithm and go somewhere else, it may not perform well and you don't know why. So the there there has to be I think at a minimum for most algorithms in medicine, there has to be some level of external validity where an algorithm was tested on some geographically distinct or population distinct or some external data, and you have to justify
Yeah.
that. Because most of the papers that are in the literature with AI tools in medicine, most of them have not done that. And I think that's probably AI's like Achilles heel is like proving that the algorithm generalizes because the danger is you often don't know that it doesn't generalize unless you test. So everything could look great internally, but until you test it, you don't know.
So here's a summary for the layperson. If you've seen the meme of the AI algorithm trying to differentiate between chihuahuas and blueberry muffins, um, it doesn't do a very good job. So what you're trying to do is to try to train the algorithm to differentiate better between blueberry muffins and chihuahuas. Except the what's at risk here isn't whether or not it's a blueberry muffin or a chihuahua. What's at risk here is whether or not the patient gets a potentially harmful procedure done. And that's why it's so
Yeah,
important.
and put it this way, you don't know that your algorithm can't differentiate between chihuahuas and blueberry muffins unless you test it on blueberry muffins,
Fair enough.
right? So if your data set just contains different kinds of dogs and then you test it somewhere else and that data contains blueberry muffins, your performance will look great internally in your testing, but when you deploy it, it's going to not perform well.
Fascinating. I have never related that back to a meme before, but there's a first for everything. There's a first for everything. So, I mean, given your recent success in terms of being able to, move forward with the patenting or the provisional patenting of what you're doing, as well as the breakthrough status, you mentioned that you haven't raised funds. Why haven't you done that? It seems like every day there's this new announcement of like XYZ company has raised X million dollars at blah valuation. And it seems exciting to laypersons like, oh my God, that's so much money. But why haven't you done that? Wouldn't that spur your development faster to enable you to actually be able to help patients faster?
It's a good question, and it's something we spend a reasonable amount of time thinking, and we often revisit this question. The question we ask ourselves is, would X million dollars get us to our next milestone faster? And often the answer is no. Um, and that's really why we haven't raised money so far. We've been lucky in the sense that one, we've been able to, again, leverage the ecosystem to fund our work so far. We have a very lean, but an extremely passionate team. And this would be impossible without our team. So we have the right lean team. We have we've leveraged funding to support this team. And the milestones that we have, a lot of it, like for a while, we were limited by data. We can't develop these things without data. So, you know, data is reliant on a third partner, and often having money sitting in the bank can't really influence internal processes. At least we've found that it doesn't really influence internal processes for getting data out. So we decided not to raise because of that. It's getting to the point now where if we raise money, it's not going to be to make the product because we've already made the product. It's going to be to scale. It's going to be to, we have this thing that's approved. We want a sales and support team to just scale to the market. Um, but this is something that's very, it's a very complicated decision because the other thing is we're sort of, we operate at the intersection of two fairly specialized fields.
Mhm.
It's the intersection of, you know, radiology, and the intersection of like cutting edge sort of machine learning. And we went through this CDL program, the Creative Destruction Lab. We graduated a couple of years ago, and we met a lot of world class investors. But there are probably I can probably count on my one hand how many investors I would feel comfortable dictating the path of the company because I think very few people understand both sides of the coin like we do.
Mhm.
So that's also a reason we haven't raised is we're when you bring on an investor, you bring another partner to the table, like that's a decision maker. And so finding somebody that you're comfortable making these big decisions that dictate the long-term health of the company, I think is you need to really vet somebody for that.
Mhm, mhm. I think that's a definitely a really well thought out answer, and it's certainly really important to pick the right person to support you in terms of decision making, as well as to help you scale the product. Because again, you can create something that could help millions, if not billions, of people, but if it's not spread out there properly with the proper sales team, etc., then it's not going to impact that many people. That's why it's important. But overall, it seems like you've done so much in the like entrepreneurial side of things with 16-bit. Do you continue any work in the clinical or academic sense?
Yeah, yeah. So we've always seen our unique advantage is that the clinical side and the technical machine learning side. And so, our sort of view is we always want to keep a foot in clinical medicine, at least to some degree. And so right now I have like a 3 day a week, 2.5 to 3 day a week, depending on the week, clinical practice. And that's at an academic institution. And that keeps me grounded. Like I really enjoy clinical work. Like I like impacting patient care, so I get some of that. But it also keeps me grounded is like what's going on in the trenches.
Hmm.
Like what are the next problems we want to solve? What do I think? Where do I think the machine learning technology we've developed or that we could develop? Where can it really make an impact in sort of the day to day clinical workflow of a radiology department? It's hard to see that if you're not in it, and, for that reason, we really value um, our clinical work, really value it. On the other advantage to having a clinical work, particularly in an academic setting, is that it keeps you in not only in the sort of in the trenches for clinical work, but in the trenches for like what's going on in the research world.
Mhm.
Um, and we talk about the lab and stuff like that too, but it's like, it's just another avenue to pursue this kind of work from a different perspective. And I really think like the more I learn and the more I see and the more sort of I live, like the interesting things happen at the intersection of fields,
Yeah.
because there are much fewer people at those intersections than, there's lots of computer scientists or there's lots of doctors, but there are few people that have both of those skill sets. And that's when you see opportunities that others may have missed.
hmm hmm Okay. So, I mean, here's a question that I guess I'd love your opinion on. In terms of regulation around data sets that you can get from your hospital because you're connected to them clinically and academically, it's really hard, rightfully so, because there are there's privacy legislation that makes sure that all this data has to be de-identified, etc., for the safety of the patient. But there are cultures and countries out there that don't necessarily have these restrictions. And as a result, they're able to gain more traction in the artificial intelligence, machine learning space, especially perhaps in the medical field. What you've had to do as a consequence of that, perhaps, I don't know, is target that less obvious problem of osteoporosis rather than mammograms. So how do you plan to compete with these perhaps bigger companies that have larger data sets that can easily sell into Canada just as well?
So it's a great question. The first thing I would say is that there is a point probably in most domains where there's diminishing returns to your data,
hmm
just like in most things, right? Like, you read 10 textbooks on a topic, the 11th textbook probably doesn't give you as much as the first one
hmm
did, right? Similar sort of thing.
You should tell my mom
So,
that.
well, for you in med school, maybe not. Maybe get to 50 and then we can talk. Um, but so that's one thing. Like just because you have more data doesn't mean your system is
Yeah.
better. But the other thing that I think is probably more important is that like the use case, like our use case for osteoporosis, I think is like very compelling. And it's compelling from every angle. Like it's compelling from the medical imaging department side. It's compelling from the patient side. It's compelling from the payer side. And what I mean by payer is like who pays for the healthcare. In Canada, it's the government that pays for healthcare, provincial mostly. In the US, it's a private insurance company. So it's very compelling from all these sides. And I think coming up with this solution is not obvious. And the reason we can do so is because of our sort of multidisciplinary background. So I think just because there's a really well-funded company that is based in a country that have more lenient privacy laws and thus they have more data, I don't think that means that they're going to win. And we've seen that. We've seen big companies that have raised lots of money that have been around since we started, and they've been either, sold for pieces or haven't been successful and haven't really generated revenue. And this sort of jump back and forth it ties to your previous question around like why haven't we raised money? And one of the reasons we didn't raise money at the time is back in sort of 2016 when we made the company, we didn't feel like the market was ready to purchase AI
Yeah.
solutions, partly because the regulatory guidelines weren't there. The clinical world wasn't comfortable using it. So to raise $30 million, you're now on a clock to generate revenue. Otherwise, you have to raise again just to survive. So it's like it's something that we didn't think was the strategically right decision. And I'm not saying we could have raised that money back then, because you have to have a compelling product, but we didn't pursue it really because it didn't seem to make a lot of sense. Um, I forget your current question
My
now.
current question was like, how do you plan to compete with these larger
Oh,
groups? Yeah.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, just because they have more money and they may have access to more data doesn't mean they're gonna win. I think there's a lot of art in figuring out how to properly introduce machine learning in a way that motivates all of the stakeholders and improves patient care, because it is like a sad truth that because resources are infinite, just because something improves the health of people doesn't mean it's implemented or adopted
Mhm.
because of cost, right? You need to reach a certain level of your product has to make a certain amount of health economic sense in order to be implemented
Mhm.
and deployed. And so you want to design something that properly influences all the stakeholders, and I think that's still very much an art, and that's where the clinical domain knowledge and the technical knowledge, that's where it really helps.
You're dropping knowledge bombs there. There are so many things that I want to ask questions about, but we don't have time. I do want to close off though by asking you if there are any pluggables that you want to plug, anything that you want to share, any websites, Twitter handles, etc.
To be honest, we're not too active on social media. Our website has been up 16 www.16bit.ai. We're updating it recently. It's hasn't been updated in a while, mostly because we've really been heads down product development for a year. It's been quite a lot of work, and we're very proud of the work that we've done. You can find us on LinkedIn, but probably in the next 2 weeks or so, we'll be updating our site. It'll be reflective of what we're currently doing, and there'll be a contact page. So if anybody wants to reach out, um, demo, or just get in touch, potential partner, potential research, we're pretty fast with our replies.
Sounds great. And you can find How It's Med on at How It's Med on Twitter and LinkedIn and at howitsmed.com. Thank you.